Hey, what's up everybody? Chris the Alfa Nut here, and today I wanted to talk about the fact that not everybody has a lot of money to spend on a car, and for a long time when I was younger I used to buy old nails, basically anything that I could afford that was likely to last for more than 6 months. And my criteria when I was choosing a car was always the same. What can I get that's nice looking, hopefully reliable, fun to drive, cheap as chips? Well, it just so happens that there's an Alfa Romeo right now that falls into those categories, and these are stupidly cheap cars at the moment. They are real bargains. The car I'm talking about, it's the Alfa Romeo GT. I put out a question on my Facebook page a little while ago asking whether people would be interested in seeing a video on the Giulia Quadrifoglio or the Alfa Romeo GT. Guess which one won? That's right, it was the GT. Incidentally, if you haven't subscribed to my Facebook page yet, you'll find it in the description below. So the point is, there's obviously a lot of people at the moment who are interested in the GT because obviously it's great looking, it's cheap, it's fun to drive, and there aren't many cars that fall into all of those categories at the same time. Now, you probably know that I don't normally make buyer's guide videos, but because I've owned the car for about 2 years, I've got lots of stuff to share about it. So before we go and give the car some love, make sure that you smash that like button down there and subscribe if you haven't subscribed already. Better. So here we are on a lovely wet August day. It's typical of my luck when I want to do shooting that I'll get up in the morning and the sun will be shining, and as soon as I get in the car the clouds go dark and it starts to rain. Great. So today we're driving my 2007 Alfa Romeo GT 1.9 JTDm, and had this car for about 2 years. I originally bought it for my wife. To be specific, I bought it for my wife so that hopefully she might understand a little better when she drove an Alfa Romeo every day, and I think that's worked. So that's a result. But also the GT is actually a very good everyday car. I mean, it's very, very comfortable. It looks great. It's very economical. This version has the sat nav and the Bose stereo, which obviously are very nice things to have. The air conditioning works, mainly because I just spent about 250 quid repairing it, but now obviously it works, which is essential in the summer, as anyone who has these cars who has a non-working air conditioning unit will testify. What I'm going to do today, I'm just going to have a bit of a chat about how it feels to drive, practicalities, the day-to-day pros and cons of having a GT as a daily driver. So let's go. So I think one of the first things that I noticed when I first drove the GT was how the seats feel. and you know, every car is different. Every car has certain immediate impressions, good and bad. And for me, one of the most positive impressions that this car made on me was the actual driving position, because it's very comfortable. You sit fairly low down because it is quite a low car, but the seats, for me at least, fit me very well, and the side bolsters are very comfortable. They're very smooth. There's no sharp edges or sort of uncomfortable bits digging into your ribs. And when I first bought this car, I actually drove it all the way back from North Yorkshire all the way down to Devon, which is a journey of over 300 miles. And three things that really struck me during that first drive were how comfortable the seats were. More comfortable than the seats in my BMW, for instance, which is pretty surprising considering they're supposed to be comfort seats. And the second thing was how good this car feels on the motorway. It's very comfortable, it's pretty quiet. The visibility certainly around the side and through the screen are very good. Visibility to the back isn't so good because obviously it's quite a small aperture, the back window. But the third thing that struck me was when I actually got back to my house after the 300-mile trip, I checked the trip meter, which I'd zeroed before I set off, and I'd actually averaged 57 miles per gallon, which I was pretty astonished at for a 10-year-old car, actually more like 12 years now, with 130,000 miles on the clock. 57 miles per gallon is pretty amazing. That is probably in part due to the fact that it's not a particularly big car, it's not that heavy, and it has the very common diesel engine, which is also fitted to a lot of the Vauxhall range of cars. So it was a kind of a collaboration engine, and I believe it's fitted to a wider variety of cars than just to Alfa Romeos. So obviously it's quite well proven. As a collaborative effort, the engine was quite well designed. Unfortunately, it's quite noisy. I don't know whether that's common for all of these engines, but obviously this one's done 130 odd thousand miles, which isn't a huge amount for a diesel engine. As long as it's been well maintained, these engines can go 250,000 miles. But it is a little bit taxi-like. So when you start it up in the morning, it is quite rattly and it's a bit noisy, and it sounds like a London taxi's outside your house. But having said that, this particular engine, which can suffer from a couple of issues, most notably swirl flaps, which were a design feature, basically, which is like a electromechanical series of flaps which swirl the mixture or swirl the fuel and air before it enters the cylinders to give a cleaner burn. That's the theory. I'm sure it works very well, but the problem is once the system gets a bit older, the swirl flaps can actually snap off and end up in the cylinders. And there are two types of swirl flaps, metal ones and plastic ones. Obviously the plastic ones, although you don't really want foreign bodies inside your cylinders, the plastic ones do a lot less damage than the metal ones, which can obviously wreck your valves completely. So this particular car still has its swirl flaps, but a lot of people are removing these systems to add a bit of longevity to their engine. Anyway, this one's also been remapped, so from a standard 150 bhp, which for a turbo diesel engine is pretty sort of mid-range power-wise, it's nothing fancy. This one's been remapped to 175 bhp, which gives it a lot more push, gives it a lot more low-down grunt, which is what diesel engines, turbo diesel engines at least, are best at. also a car that won awards when it first came out, and to be fair, the design still looks fresh today. At the end of the day, it's a coupe which has certain limitations. The doors, for instance, are pretty wide, which is necessary to allow people to get into the back seat because it's only a two-door car. And one of the drawbacks of having long doors, of course, is in tighter parking spaces, like the supermarket, for instance. You end up having to squeeze to get out of the car because the doors really won't open as wide as you'd like them to in a standard supermarket car park. You're also very easy to ding the edges of the doors on walls, lampposts, small children, passing dogs, other people's cars. Hey! You've got to be really careful. And to add to that, the spring on the door is also quite strong, which means that you have to hang on to it, which isn't really helped by the handles, the grab handles being so far towards the hinges, because it doesn't really give you, well, the fulcrum effect is basically quite pronounced. When you're trying to open or close the door, you have to give it a good tug because the handle is so far towards the hinge. The handle would be better off halfway down the door, really. Anyway, this platform was first seen in the 156. That means that the suspension, in common with a lot of other Alfa Romeos of this era, appear to be made of chocolate, and they do tend to wear quite quickly due to the large number of ball joints and bushes. And in fact, this particular car has just passed its MOT this morning, which is why I'm now able to drive it legally. And it failed on a number of things. It failed on one of the tyres. The inner edge was worn due to the tracking. If you get your car tracking set according to the factory standards, you will find that the inner edges of your tyres will wear very quickly, because the tyres are towed out like this, a bit like the rear wheels on my Spider. So yes, it failed on tyres, which was an expense. It also failed on the one of the front upper wishbones was worn, the ball joint was worn, so that had to be replaced as well. A couple of other things like CV joint gaiter and a couple of other minor things, but essentially whenever you MOT your GT or your 156, and to a certain extent a Spider or a GTV as well, you will probably come across a regular requirement for new suspension arms. So if you're thinking about buying a GT or a 156, the model that it was based on previously, you probably would need to give that area a bit of attention before deciding to buy one. So if you test drive it, it's usually fairly easy to tell if the suspension has wear or is on its way out, because you'll feel a rattle through the steering wheel generally when you go over bumps or potholes or ridges in the road. It's like a slight chattering sensation. If you feel a rattling down by your feet, however, then that's probably not suspension, that's probably anti-roll bar bushes, which cost the same kind of money to replace. Personally, if bushes fail on any of my cars, I like to replace them with silicon Powerflex bushes or similar, because they're a bit tighter, they're sturdier, they make the car handle better, and they last forever. Okay, so other things, well, heating and ventilation system on the GT is okay. It's not great. It has similar challenges to the 156. It is better than the 156, however, which is a little bit like having a wheezy old man breathing on you when you put the fan on full. Not ideal. Demisting and air conditioning on the 156 are marginal. On the GT they're quite acceptable. Still perhaps not as good as you would want, but they work. Other aspects of the GT that are relevant for for a purchaser. The sills, well, the sills on the GT are actually very good looking. They're very handsome. Unfortunately, what they also are as part of the structure of the side of the car. So if you look beneath the doors, you'll find the sills are quite nicely crafted steel panels. And unfortunately, what tends to happen is when garages who aren't familiar with the GT put them up on a ramp, they don't make sure that the pads that contact the underneath of the car are far enough up away from the supporting arms. That sometimes means that when the supporting arms come up, they crush the sills. If a sill gets crushed, then that can quite easily start the sill rusting, and quite often it can happen from the inside out. I know that's an old cliche with Alfas. Oh, Alfas rust from the inside out. But in some areas it can be true. So sills, you need to check those carefully. If they have been crushed or damaged by a careless mechanic, then you do need to check those carefully to make sure that they haven't started to rust as a result. In terms of equipment, well, the GT is pretty well equipped. Certainly this particular car has a very good level of equipment. It's got steering wheel mounted stereo controls. It has a Bose stereo with a subwoofer in the boot, which sounds pretty good. It's got intermittent wipers, of course. It's got headlight washers. It's got electric windows. It's got central locking. It's got a remote boot release on the key fob. It's got pretty much most of the creature comforts that you would expect in a modern car. There are some things that it would benefit from, but obviously the Fiat Alfa parts bin didn't have those in at the time, which is stuff like a Bluetooth stereo. The sat-nav now looks pretty outdated, although it's relatively easy to still get CDs for the sat-nav. You have to put a DVD CD into the unit for it to work, and I think the last iteration of the maps that you can get for this particular car are from about 2011, so not the most up-to-date, but still pretty, you know, it's usable. And for a car that costs a couple of £1,000, you can't really complain. Which brings me on to the topic of pricing, which is the GT's strongest point at the moment. These are really good cars. They're very practical, they look fantastic, they perform well, they're extremely comfortable, they're very economical if you buy the diesel version. Not so much if you buy the V6 Busso. I'll get onto that one in a minute. But the point is, you can pick up a usable GT in, you know, not particularly great condition, but certainly usable and with an MOT for as little as £1,000, or even less if you want to take the risk. This particular car cost me £2,500 about 2 years ago, mainly because it had a lot of new parts. It had a year's MOT and it was in really nice condition. It's also a very well spec'd car. But it makes you think, what else could you buy for that money that looks this nice, that performs so well for £2,500? I can't think of very much, to be honest. I can't think of very much. So around town, the suspension is pretty firm. This one's had new suspension on the back. The GTs do suffer from a very common fault, which appears to be, I suppose you could call it a design fault, but basically on the rear suspension, on the spring mounts where the rear suspension spring sits on the shock absorber, there is a spring plate which is basically like a platform, if you will, that goes all the way around the shock absorber, and the bottom of the spring sits on that plate. And the plate has a drain hole in it for water to drain out, but unfortunately the drain hole tends to get blocked, and what happens is water sits on the spring mount and eventually it rusts through the spring mount and the suspension collapses. And yes, this did happen to this car. My wife was driving it, luckily at low speed through town, and suddenly, crash, the back end of the car went like that. She managed to stop safely and we got the car recovered, but it's a dangerous possibility. And if you're thinking about buying one of these cars, you can't always see whether the spring mount is actually rotten or not. But if you want my advice, you need to get the car up on a ramp or get underneath it and have a good poke around at the suspension mounts with something like a screwdriver to see whether there are any holes in it or whether your screwdriver goes through it. If so, it's either a good negotiating tool or walk away and get something else. Performance is pretty brisk on this one because with 175 brake horsepower in a relatively small car, it goes pretty well. So at an indicated 75 miles per hour, I'm averaging 58.2 miles per gallon. That's pretty good. Obviously the petrol engine versions won't get anywhere near that, but the 2-litre JTS engine car will probably average about 35 miles per gallon. You might even get 40 on a longer run. The V6 Busso is one of my favourite engines, as you probably already guessed if you've seen any of my other videos, and the version of the GT that's fitted with this engine has the very last version, because it was discontinued in 2005, I believe. Anyway, the bottom line is that the 3-litre Busso V6 fitted to the GT complements it very well, and versions of the GT with the Busso engine are beginning to increase in value disproportionately to the other GTs. You'll pay at the moment between £5,000 and £8,000 for a decent GT with a V6 Busso, which is probably 3 or maybe even 4 times what you would pay for the same GT but with a 2-litre engine. I have to say, one other thing about the GT, in common with a lot of Alfa Romeos, the steering is extremely nice. It's very direct. You feel very connected with the road surface, but in fact in the GT, not in a tiring way. In some cars with very high geared steering, a very sensitive steering and communicative steering, that can get quite wearing after a while. So if you're driving the car on a long distance and you're feeling every little bump and ripple in the road, you know, that over a long distance can get old, and it can get to the point where you would really rather be driving a car with less communication through the steering wheel, because that's more relaxing, frankly. I have to say, with the GT, it's a very good balance. You still feel connected with the road, you still know what the front wheels are doing, you still know if you're about to lose grip. The car's very pointy still, and it goes where you want it to go almost telepathically, but it's not too much, and on a long journey it doesn't get too tiring. It's actually a very comfortable car to drive. Did I say that already? I'll say it again. The GT is a very comfortable car to drive.